want to welcome everybody to the Reformation celebration, a celebration of the 500th anniversary of Luther's Reformation. So next week will mark the 500th year that Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg, Germany, or should I say Wittenberg? I think that's the correct pronunciation. So this is a practical start of people questioning the Roman Catholic tradition that led into the Reformation. And it grew into a Reformation in the subsequent years. It was a return to the Scriptures, along with the correct doctrine, especially of justification by faith. And tonight we're actually going to be singing a number of Luther's hymns in a while here. You would have got 12 Reformation hymns, and this is published by Ambassador Publishing House of the AFLC. You probably got that from the monk in the entrance there. And also we're going to hear from Jason Coyle, one of our congregational members here at Good Shepherd, of some history, and I believe it's from the 95 Theses to the Diet of Worms, right? And we're also going to be celebrating this Sunday, if you'd like to join us for that worship service. And then furthermore, next Wednesday, Israel Vasquez Flores from the Atheltus Seminary, my classmate, he will be speaking. So I'll be on November 1st. And after Jason speaks, we'll do one more hymn, and then you can join us in the fellowship hall for snacks and fellowship and games after, if you'd like to do games. And in this Luther hymnal booklet, we're going to sing 3 songs from here. Please leave these in your pew, or else you can put them in the entrance with the rest of them. If you would like one, you can purchase it on Wednesday, but we're going to use these not only today, but Sunday and Wednesday next week. So at the end of the whole shebang, you can purchase one for $2 if you would like. And actually, Luther, I don't know if you knew this, he was kind of the father of congregational song. Singing was almost exclusively done by the clergy and the choir when he would go to church in the Roman Catholic Church in Europe at that time. And in this, the congregational singing that we do here and how Luther started that tradition, you can see Luther's emphasis on the priesthood of all believers, as it says in 1 Peter 2, verses 4 through 5. As you come to Jesus, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves are like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. And right here, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So if you think of that, what if you had Pastor Rob just singing during the worship service? And then we had the church choir, and then you guys out in the, I don't know if we'd have instruments or not. It might have been just a cappella. The congregation would only do a few things here and there, some call and response liturgy. And the liturgy is good, but it's even better when the congregation gets to sing. So Luther kind of got that started. He loved music. So we can celebrate that today as we sing his hymns, a few of his hymns. And actually, in 1524, Luther came out with a hymn book that had 23 hymns that he wrote, and he probably was involved with arranging the music too. So to begin, you can open up to number 10 in your booklet, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. And then right after A Mighty Fortress is Our God, we will sing, Lord, keep us steadfast in thy word, and that's number 7. So we'll begin with number 10, and then we'll do number 7. And I should say the last hymn will only be 5 verses. There's 10 verses to it, so only do 5 verses, okay? And Bear, you probably know them all. But yeah, so and if you keep singing, you'll be singing on your own, but that's okay. All right. So why don't we stand for the first song, and then you may be seated for the second one.
You may be seated. We're not going to do the projector, which is too bad. I've got it it's multimedia extravaganza, but apparently I can't get it connected, so you'll just have to take my word for it. It's brilliant. Today is a little different than usually when I'm up here. This is going to be more of a historical overview, a discussion, more of a teaching thing. I will leave it to the seminarians to deal more with the theological side of things and to preach on the topic. But at the same time, when we look at history, a lot of times we have, well, some of us are fascinated by it, and a lot of us just fall right asleep. And I've thought about it a lot, and because I've been a history buff since I was little, probably my dad's fault. But when I was in school, especially in high school, it seemed like history classes were the classes where they didn't necessarily, and I'm going to apologize in advance for this story, sorry, but it's not necessarily the strongest teachers that they would have teach history, at least in my experience. And I moved around a lot, so maybe I just had bad experiences here. But it tended to be the coaches. This is the apology part, but yeah, and I think it's because history is a nice, easy subject to test on, right? Because you have names, you have dates, you can put together multiple choice questions. You don't even need to do essay questions. It's really easy to put together things that way. And so for somebody who may be a little bit more uncomfortable in certain roles, it's simpler. Plus, maybe the typing class was already filled by another coach. So they don't do taping anymore anyway, I suppose. But so today I want to try to maybe give us an overview and tell it more as a story, because I think when history starts to come alive, it's when we start to see how things interact with each other. And I'll give you an example of this that maybe is a little bit more related to each of you individually. Think about the last time that you went to a gas station and you got to fill up a gas, or you were at a store or someplace like that and they had some sort of music going on. Right, because when you're at the gas stations now, they're playing a radio station there, or you go to the stores and there's the music and stuff. I was in radio, so I can't not hear those things. But if you think about it and you listen to it, is the music that you hear music that you remember from what part of your own life? Thinking about it another way, think about the songs that were popular when you were in high school. Whenever that was. For me, it was the mid-'80s. So, you know, it was when, let's see, well, it was the hair band era, right? So you had Bon Jovi and some of those other groups like that. But when I was at a gas station yesterday, I was filling, or no, it was when I was at a store yesterday, and they went song after song after song. They were all from 1984, 1985, 1986. Now, for me, that's last week. Okay? But if you do the math, you know, it's, let's see, 85, 95, 105. It's 30 years ago, longer than that. Okay, so now what you do is you go back 30 years from when you remember those songs being on the radio. So for 85, that takes us back to 55. That predates the Beatles. And that's ancient history for me. You know? And it's perspective. And sometimes that's what I think we lose sight on when we deal with history is that sort of a perspective. We lack those kind of mind or those mental mind posts. And if I can try to give you some of those, maybe it can be useful today. So when we start, there's two things that I want you to keep in mind as we go through all of this. The first one is this idea of the medieval mindset. When we look back at Luther, when we look back at what he wrote, what he said, what he went through, it's really hard for us to even think about those things in context because we don't live in that world. We are rational people. We have been taught completely differently, scientifically, and all these other sorts of things. So we just don't think about life the way that Luther did, the way that the people that Luther was the pastor for did. They had a much more medieval mindset, and part of that was that the Spirit was always nearby. I was reading an article today about it, and I thought it put it in an interesting mindset, which is just look at the Lord's Prayer and think about somebody looking at the Lord's Prayer and taking every single line of it literally, completely, and just believing it in the depths and core of their being. We try to do that. We think of it that way. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Those sorts of things are important to us, but they aren't, they aren't bedrock in the same sense of, everything around you is horrible. All of these things are meant to make you look upward, meant to make you see the spiritual. If you ever look at cathedrals that were built in the Middle Ages and moving forward, they're these huge, towering edifices. Everything is designed just to draw your eyes and your mind and your heart upward towards the spiritual, towards the things that are to come. Because life was really hard, in part. And it wasn't just they had that attitude about God. Many of the people, particularly in Luther's area, or at least in Luther's area, they also had a real historical, there was a lot of folk tales. There was a lot of, where Luther was growing up, in the town that he lived, they had mountains surrounding it with huge dark forests and wolves and all these other sorts of things. And it wasn't just wolves they were thinking about. There were witches in those things. There were fairies. There were all these other sorts of things that were as real to them as the wolves. And that was just a completely different way of thinking about things that we just have a really hard time getting a grasp of. And because of that, sometimes we don't necessarily think about, okay, why was this important to him? Why was this something he was willing to fight on? Or why would he let go of these other things? It was in part because of just his different perspective on these things. So these things had an impact on the world of that day in big and small ways. I'll give you one kind of silly example. Have you ever heard of the idea of trial by combat? The idea of trial by combat was this idea, and they use it in movies and TV shows now. It's kind of an Old West thing now. It's in a lot of Westerns too. The idea is, if you have been wronged, you challenge the person that wronged you to combat. You have a shootout, or you have knights run at each other and do whatever. And the person who is right always wins. That's the rule. Trial by combat, because God is on the side of the right. Now, there is some ability to abuse a system like that, but that's something that they held to. They really did believe in that. But it is hard for us to imagine. So I'll try to remind you of that as we go through it. And as I already mentioned, the other thing that I kind of take into account is the idea of historical bookmarks. So in the period of time that we're talking about here, we're talking about the really early 1500s. 1517 is 500 years ago from this year. But we're kind of dealing with, maybe 20 years before, 20 years after, if we think about it. Now, that seems like a long time ago. And did anything else happen? And I guess two examples, again, to try to underline this idea. I was flabbergasted when I was studying the story of Samson in the Bible. And I did the math. And if the math holds, and I've looked it up in other places, Samson was a judge of Israel when Samuel was a young prophet. They may have known each other. They may have interacted with each other. They may have not liked each other. We don't think about that. It's also hard to think about the United States Revolution, the colonies, 1776 and all those other sorts of things, without the more you understand about what was going on in Europe, with Britain and France fighting each other, and we were just this kind of asterisk off in the corner in world events, but we don't think about it that way because we're Americans, and the world revolves around us. So, what other things might you know about that happened about this same time that you didn't maybe tie the connection? Well, in 1481, so this is about 30 years before we're talking about here, the Spanish Inquisition began. 1492, what happened in 1492? Anyone? All right. Education system lives. All right. Columbus sailed, discovered, or at least ran into the West Indies, and that had an enormous impact upon the political and structure of Europe at the time that Luther was involved here. We'll talk about that a little bit. Henry VIII, you know who he is, right? He was king of England during the time that Luther was going through this. In fact, he was almost emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at this time, which would have kind of changed a lot of things in that time period, but it's just kind of interesting. Magellan circumnavigating the globe, or at least his body, because he died halfway through, in 1519. Cortez conquered Mexico in 1519. All of these things, if you study them in school, were all happening about this time. And that's just on the political explorer side of things. You ever hear of the Mona Lisa? That was painted in 1506. 10 years, basically, before Luther and the 95 Theses. The statue of David, Michelangelo's statue of David, he started that in 1501. The Sistine Chapel started getting painted in 1512. Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were active and at the height of their power at this time. I don't necessarily think of things that way. It's kind of interesting. And all this stuff is before things that you might know about too, like Galileo. Galileo's whole big stuff all happened in the late 1500s. Don Quixote, the novel, 1605. Shakespeare, around 1600, give or take 10 years. So 100 years after Luther is when Shakespeare was around. Now again, Shakespeare to us, ancient history, we can't even understand it. So that's kind of trying to put things in a little bit of perspective. So setting the stage now of what we're talking about, we really had a lot of fluctuation. There was a lot of things that were kind of being juggled in the air in society and in the church and in the empire. And this is important because sometimes when we start thinking about Luther, when we start thinking about the 95 Theses and all these other sorts of things, we lose track of how much politics and how much the society all interacts with these things. And sometimes that's helpful for us. Sometimes people use it wrongly, but I think it's useful for us to really, it can strengthen our confidence in God being in control if we really understand how many plates are spinning at the same time. So society was really in flux. The Black Death, the plague, had just devastated Europe. Depending on where you were, anywhere from 1 in 3 to 1 in 2 to 80 to 90% of the population of a town was just obliterated. This was about 200 years before, so the 1350s, around that period of time. I remember being stunned when I was in school in 4th and 5th grade, and they had that graph of the population of the world. And it's this lovely little ramp going up, and then all of a sudden there's this speed bump. That's the Black Death. It actually changed the population of the world in a measurable way. And it was, more importantly, changing the population of the world where it hit the hardest. Because think of it this way. They didn't have machines, right? So if you're a farmer and you had, 15, 20 people that were helping you bring in the crops every year, and all of a sudden 15 of them aren't there anymore, how important is it for you to hang on to the other 5? Everybody got a raise. Okay? And it really helped to start driving the growth of this idea of the middle class, which is so important to us today. It just changed. It was for 1,000 years before that, everything was the same. And now it wasn't anymore. The printing press gets started just before this time. And we can see the effect of that in the world around us today. It just completely changed. I mean, books going from being labors of years to just produce, to being able to just print off thousands of copies and distribute them. And that drove the idea of literacy being important. At the time, literacy in cities was maybe 20%. In the countryside, it was a lot lower than that. Nobody needed to know how to read. Oh, and by the way, from what I've read, if you didn't know how to, back then, not many people knew how to read. They had memories that we cannot fathom. Their problem-solving skills, if I have to figure out how to change a light in my car, what do? I go to, YouTube. I Google it, and I have a nice little instruction manual. These guys wouldn't have had that, obviously, but these guys, they could figure out problems. I read a story once, and it's hypothetical, but I think it's evocative of this person who came across, a person from that era comes across basically like a knitted t-shirt from today's age. And he was able actually to figure out how to knit it back again, because that's just the way they could think about those things. They'd memorize and memorize and memorize. It's just phenomenally things that they could do. People didn't travel more than 7 miles from their home for their entire lives. It's just a different way of doing things. But now people were starting to move around more because they were aware of things outside themselves. The church was in flux. They had just had 2 or 3 centuries of a lot of very worldly popes, let's put it that way. In fact, they had some times when there was 2 or 3 popes at the same time, and they'd, excommunicate each other. It was kind of like watching a really weird game of tennis where they get mad at each other. Some names you may have heard of if you studied history on that. A lot of popes came from a family called the Medicis. And the Medicis were basically, if you've ever seen or heard of the Godfather movies, that were these guys. And they were popes. Because they knew how to work the system. There was a lot of politics in the church at that time. Locally, in the area that Luther was in, they had a new archbishop, the Archbishop of Mainz. And this is kind of interesting because they had a rule saying that a guy couldn't be the archbishop of more than one place at the same time. But this guy wanted to be the archbishop of more than one place, so he got a special dispensation and he got a second one. And then this Mainz one opened up, and he really wanted Mainz. So he went back to the Pope again. And how do you think, if there's a rule against something, but you really want to make it happen, and you're talking to the person with the power to make it happen, how do you do it? Money talks. That'll come into play in a little bit. And the church was also dealing with these pre-reformers that you may have heard of in the 2 or 3 centuries, 2 centuries really, about 100 years, I guess. That's 1 century before Luther. Guys named Wycliffe and Huss, who were teaching many of the same things that Luther would come to teach. Wycliffe wanted the Bible in the vernacular, in English. He did a translation of the Bible into English. Huss was a Bavarian who taught that the church was comprised of only those who believed. That sounds like a really radical thought, doesn't it? Huss had a little bit of a bad day. The church didn't like him that much, and so they had a council at the Council of Constance, about 1514, something like that. And they promised him safe passage because he was going to go and he was going to explain what he believed, and they talked to him about it. And he got there, and they talked about it a little bit, and then they said, that safe passage thing, that psych. And Huss didn't make it out of there. He was martyred. But there was a whole series of, there was something called the Hussite Wars in Bavaria for a long time period there that had an effect that was still reverberating in the minds of people in the time of Luther. And the empire was in flux. They had this idea of the Holy Roman Empire, but the nationalism was really growing. Spain and France and Germany least of the 3, but they were all groups of individuals or societies that were coming together as a national identity as opposed to this empirical thing. The Muslim invasion was on people's minds. In 1492, they finally kicked the Muslim conquerors out of Europe as a whole. They were in parts of Spain, and they got rid of them there. But the Ottoman Empire was still trying to come up into Europe, and they were almost there. They were turned back at the gates of Vienna 10 years after the 95 Theses. Vienna. So that was kind of important. That was getting a lot of attention on the political side. The emperor was a little bit more concerned about that, maybe, than he was about this monk in this backwater Wittenberg. So when we look at the players of this drama, I mean, this is where I think it comes in. You got to put some skin on the bones of these people. So we'll hit a few of them, and then we'll wrap. We'll go through the story. But like I said, I think if we can start seeing these individuals as actual people, then we can sort of understand maybe what's going on a little bit more. So the first guy is a guy named Johann Meyer von Eck, or John Eck. Just go with Eck. That's where he was from, but for some reason that's what they called him. He was a very vocal critic of Luther. He, again, had a phenomenal memory, and he was really well known for being a very good debater. But his style was kind of like a steamroller, right? He wasn't a brilliant individual that made these big flashes. He would just plod and plod and plod and just run you over with all of his words. But he was very well known, very, very popular. Very, very powerful, and he was a very vocal defender of the Catholic Church and Roman Catholic doctrine. John Eck. Pope Leo X was born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici. He was one of the Godfather family. He was the Pope from 1513 to 1521, so of this period. He was a patron of the arts. Remember I talked about the Sistine Chapel and the Statue of David and things like that? He was the one that basically went to the best artists and said, you know what, I want your stuff in the churches. So he commissioned all of those things. And kind of an interesting idea here, he is the last pope that wasn't even a priest when he was elected pope. He wasn't the first, but he was the last. So he gets elected pope, and then about 3 weeks later, they have a quick ceremony to make him a priest so he can become pope. But like I said, he was a patron of the arts, and you know, what do you need if you have to hire the best artists to do years and years of work? Money again. So he basically emptied the treasury, and he needed more. And that had a lot of interesting effects, but one of them was there was this constant need for more money to come into the church, which again comes into play in our story here. But as a guy, a lot of people, you know, you think about this, okay, Leo X, he's the bad guy, right? He's the one wearing the black hat. But from what I could find, he was actually somebody that people liked. He was a nice guy. He was a very clever man. He enjoyed wordplay and word games. He'd improvise Latin poems. I know you guys do this at home too, but it was something that he was really popular. He really enjoyed doing. He was a great musician. He had a reputation as a cheerful and a moral individual. Even Luther said so in what he wrote. Now, you might want to say, well, of course he's going to say that to the guy that could have him burned at the stake, but he said it. Pope Leo X. Frederick the Wise was another player in this. And this is where it gets, like I said, it's easy to get complicated and complex, and I couldn't come up with a nice little through line for this. So I'm trying to tell it as a story as well as I can. Come up to me afterwards, ask me questions, we'll do what we can. But when we talk about the emperor in the Holy Roman Empire, when we usually think of emperors, we usually think of what? They inherit the job, right? Their dad was emperor, so they become emperor. You know, it's like the family business. But that's not how it worked in the Holy Roman Empire. They'd had all kinds of different rules, but at this period in time, the emperor was an elected position. They had certain rules, right? You had to be a king of one of these various areas. But they had 7 people in the whole of Europe that voted on who the emperor was going to be. Okay? And whoever won, they got the job. And one of them was this guy, Frederick the Wise. In fact, most of them, for some reason, were in Germany. So, he actually, the emperor, if we want to try to put this in timelines again, Luther does the 95 Theses, nails them to the church door in Wittenberg. And the emperor dies, basically right around that time period. So there wasn't an emperor. The church, Pope Leo, the guy we were just talking to, he was very big into politics and into making sure that the church stayed strong. And how is the church going to stay strong? By keeping the emperor weak. So his concern is, okay, look, we've got a guy who's a candidate in France and we got a guy who's a candidate in Spain. And I've been doing really well at keeping the two of them at each other's throats, so I don't want either one of them to win because that'll make them too strong for me. See, this is all the thought process that Leo's having. So he says, you know what? I am going to put my weight behind Frederick. He's one of the electors, so he can vote for himself. Because he's German. He's not one of those two guys. Then they're both out of the running. As I said, Henry VIII was another guy that was in the running. Frederick had a different idea on that. He voted against himself. He voted for this other guy, Charles, and he was nervous about that. He said he sent some apologies to the Pope after that. But the other thing that Frederick is known for is having relics. And relics are, you know what they are basically, but relics are these historical things that are supposed to have some connection to the early church. And remember how I talked about earlier this medieval mindset? The spirit world was so closely connected. They didn't necessarily try to do the math on these things. They didn't worry that they had 17 skulls of John the Baptist scattered through these different monasteries. But Frederick had an enormous collection. In 1518, it listed over 17,000 items. A twig from Moses' burning bush, I like that one. Hay from the holy manger. Many others. And the reason relics were important is because relics were something that the church said if you venerated these things, it would help you it would take time off of your service in purgatory. It would get you into heaven faster, basically. Simple way to put it. How do you venerate a relic? Well, we're back to money again. So Frederick's collection of relics was actually the biggest moneymaker in Wittenberg. It funded the university that Luther was at. And a diligent and pious person who rendered appropriate devotion to each of the relics in his collection would merit 1,902,202 years off of his time in purgatory. So I guess that puts you in perspective in terms of how long you'd have to be there. But so that's Frederick. Two more. Charles V. And I wish I could show you his picture because he has just a jawline it's amazing. But he's an interesting guy. Charles V, he was the emperor. He was elected emperor. He was born in 1500, so he was elected emperor when he was about 20. In fact, he was just over 20 when he met Luther for the first time. And he didn't speak German at the time, even though he's German. But he later learned it. This guy was really smart. He spoke French, Dutch, Spanish, and German. He learned the last two just because he was king in those areas, and so he wanted to be able to talk to people. He had a saying people say he had this saying, I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse. And the thing I thought was interesting, two quick facts of him. First, he's the first guy whose empire was described as being an empire on which the sun never sets. We always hear about that about Britain, right? But his was the first one. Because, remember, what happened in 1492? Columbus in America. Charles was the king of Spain. So Spain was part of the empire, and now all of a sudden Charles has territory everywhere from the eastern of Europe to the western parts of South America. And, that's pretty much the whole world as far as they knew it. Sun never set. And this is an interesting bit. He was, as far as we know, the first one to propose building a canal across the Isthmus of Panama in 1520. So he was a bit of a forward thinker there. And he was very devoted to the church, actually. It's interesting. I can't show you the picture. There's actually a candy bar in Mexico called Carlos V. It's named after the emperor from back then. I hear it's supposed to be pretty good. It's got a lot of milk in it and stuff. I don't know. I only see the picture. Okay, and then finally, we have John Tetzel. We know who that is a little bit. He was another German. He was the one that kind of lit the fire under this whole thing because he was a very popular seller of indulgences. We think of him almost like a car salesman, right? A used car salesman. He was the one that supposedly said, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, soul from purgatory springs. So he has a bad reputation amongst Lutherans. And the thing to keep in mind for him and for a lot of these people, is that the doctrine of the church, of the Catholic, of Roman Church, was not as well known. It wasn't as well lined out as it is today. In fact, it's lined out as well as it is now because Luther and some of those other guys said what they said in the 1500s. Okay? So he went a little far afield, but he didn't do it because he was trying to break the rules for the most part. What was interesting about this is, okay, so, and I'm skipping the parts that I figure you all know as far as like kind of the 95 Theses, what they are to some extent. We'll talk about it a little bit, but the 95 Theses are about this idea of indulgences, the idea that you can purchase time off in purgatory, or you can basically purchase forgiveness for your sins ahead of time. In fact, there's a story about that. There's this German nobleman who goes to Tetzel, and he says, so Tetzel, can I actually buy an indulgence for something, for a sin that I'm going to commit before I do it? Tetzel says, yeah, as long as you pay in advance, basically. He's not stupid. Tetzel's not stupid. So the nobleman says, okay, that's a good deal. Pays for this indulgence. And then, I don't know, later that day, 2 or 3 days later, Tetzel's leaving that town. Whereupon this nobleman and a bunch of his henchmen come in and just beat the daylights out of him, take his money, and leave. But they leave the indulgence there, saying, you know that sin that I was telling you about? This is the one. So Tetzel goes to the prince of that area, Prince George, and complains about this. And the prince is going to go after this nobleman and put him under trial or something like that. But he hears the whole story and he says, lets them go. So, forgiveness of sins in advance. As a result of the 95 Theses and this discussion of indulgences and the pressure on these sorts of things, the church actually publishes clarifications about what the indulgences are, and it does it about 2 or 3 years after the 95 Theses. There's a lot of people that say if they just would have done it right away, Luther would have been satisfied, and this whole thing wouldn't have blown up. But they waited a while. John Tetzel gets in trouble. Somebody makes up a lot of nasty stories about him, and so he ends up going away to a monastery, dies 2 days later, and Luther actually sends him a letter on his deathbed and says, you know, I don't blame you for this. This wasn't your fault. I thought it was kind of interesting to see that. And Luther, you kind of know. Just a couple points about him. He again had an amazing memory, and that was really useful because you'd read through a commentary, and then, well, if you ever see a collection of the books that Luther wrote, it's not a collection, it's a house. The guy just wrote and wrote and wrote, and when he wasn't writing, he had people following behind him, writing down everything he said and publishing it. There are still volumes and volumes and volumes of Luther's works that have never been translated into English 500 years later. So, phenomenal memory. And dedicated to the idea of certainty. This is something that when he went to study law, and it just bugged him. Because when you study law, you're not dealing with certainty. You're dealing with uncertainty. You're trying to, reasonable doubt, you're trying to sow that, you're trying to do what ifs, all these other sorts of things. He didn't like that. That's what drew him to theology, what drew him to philosophy initially. And then he realized, philosophy is just all about people. I want to think about, God. And so theology became his main thing. And then, yes, he was in a storm. Help me, St. Anna, I will become a monk. And he becomes a monk, and then we go on from there. I want to just list a couple of quick things before we wrap up here. Why did the idea of indulgences bother Luther? Well, we can see that if you read them. That part of it was that they were saying that they involved the forgiveness of sin. And Luther said, no, the Pope can forgive only offenses against his own law, not against God's law, which is what he said that the indulgences were accusing of. And if you read through them all, you'll also see that he talks a lot about how he gives the Pope a lot of benefit of the doubt. He says at one point, if the Pope actually knew what was being taught, what was being offered to the people of Germany in these indulgences, he would tear down the cathedral that these things are supposed to be built with that these indulgences, the money is going towards. If you read the 95 Theses, towards the end, it has a bunch of things that look like they were questions that people in Luther's church were asking him. Things like, the Pope's rich. Why is he taking money from Germany instead of just building the thing himself? Seems like a reasonable question. Lots of questions like that. But they were all, again, told in the idea of he was not saying what you're teaching with indulgences is wrong. The church is not wrong. The people that are teaching about indulgences are wrong. That's kind of his direction that he started on. Now, this is where John Eck comes back into the story. And I think I'll finish with this. Well, I won't get all the way to the diet of worms, but, sorry. So Luther publishes the 95 Theses. And if you look at the 95 Theses, basically it's an invitation to debate. It's like a Facebook post, right? You put a Facebook post out there, and anybody who wants to can write in and, well, actually, it's not like a Facebook post because it's supposed to be a scholarly debate. But you get the idea. And John Eck is really upset about these 95 Theses. He thinks that Luther's taking shots at the church. So he starts talking to a colleague of Luther and arguing with him. And they end up putting together this idea of a debate at the University of Leipzig, which is not too far away from Wittenberg. And it was originally supposed to be with this colleague of Luther's, but Luther ends up going. And it turns into mainly a thing between Eck and Luther. And when we think of it this way, it really is kind of like a college football match, because it's just crazy. The pomp and circumstance, there were so many people coming that they couldn't have it in the place they were going to have it in. They had to have it in the main hall of the castle, because there were so many people there. And all of the people that were on Luther's side with Frederick the Wise, they were on one side of the hall, and they had banners from Frederick the Wise, so they had these blue banners, let's say. And the people that were on Prince George's side and John Eck's side, they were on the other side of the hall, and they had these red banners. Is this starting to sound a little bit like that, fans of the college football thing? They actually had uniforms. and then they get together, and they actually talked about this for about 3 weeks. We can't talk about important things for 15 minutes without checking our phones. It's amazing, again, back to the idea of the attention span that these people had. But during the process of this debate, Eck actually, he was a very good debater. He said, you know what? You're a Hussite. You're talking just like that Bavarian that we killed, or that we executed for heresy a century ago. And Luther knew who Huss was, but he didn't know the details of that. But this is back again to the idea of the college football thing, because the University of Leipzig was created about 100 years ago when all of the German-speaking professors and all of the German-speaking students at another university that John Huss was at left that university because they were kicked out by Huss, essentially. So you have the entire faculty and students of this new University of Leipzig starting in animosity to John Huss. And Luther comes in and he gets accused of saying the same thing that Huss was saying. So is he the home team? No, he's not. But like I said, so they had this break. Luther goes and looks up what Huss said, and he said, you know what? I kind of am on the side of this one. I agree with him that the sola scriptura came up, the idea of the church being the body of believers, and some of these other sorts of things. The idea of the Pope not being above Scripture. And Luther pretty much had to admit all of those things in this debate with Eck. So Eck got him basically to admit that he was a heretic according to the Roman Church And so Luther went home, and he started writing more stuff. And if you take a look at the things that he wrote after that, his pen just starts on fire. He writes against the papacy. But he writes some great things about freedom of Christians, on the freedom of man. And what he means by that isn't that we have free will to do whatever we want to do. It's that because we are forgiven, we are free to do good works. And those sorts of things. And as a result of all those writings, he gets called before Worms by the emperor in 1521 for the Diet of Worms, where he's confronted with 25 of his books. 3 years, 25 books. And asked, do you recant of these things? And who asked him if he recanted of those books? John Eck. He was the spokesman for the emperor. So he comes back. Oh, and by the way, 10 years later, John Eck came back and was the main guy at the Diet of Augsburg, too, where we had the Augsburg Confession from. He's kind of like that bad penny that just keeps turning up. When Luther was excommunicated by the Pope, John Eck was one of the 2 guys that took the bull to Germany and showed it around to everybody. He really had a thing in for Luther. So what can we learn from this? If we think about these things, this is what I'd leave you with. It's that these are real people. And they were struggling with real things. And it wasn't just a theological thing. The reason that Luther wasn't attacked was because the Pope couldn't, and the Emperor, neither one could go into Germany and pull him out of there and kill him. The Pope couldn't do it because he didn't have the power. The Emperor couldn't do it because he needed the Germans on his side against the Ottoman Empire, against the Muslims. It was more complicated than that, but that's a lot of it. And there are some people that look at that and they say, see, Luther, it's no big deal. Why Luther? Well, he was just in the right place at the right time. Not like Wycliffe and Huss. Why was it the right place in the right time? Saying something like that to try to just dismiss it misses the idea of God being in control of time and God being sovereign and running everything and controlling even these massive threads that we cannot even understand to produce a proclamation of the truth, to produce an adherence to Scripture and the Word of God, and elevating that above the thought of any man. So yeah, it's not that Luther was an amazing individual, and he was flawed, and a lot of people will talk about a lot of those things. We can talk about that afterwards if you want, but bear in mind that he was an instrument. And he did the works that God appointed for him to do. And I pray that we can hear the law and the gospel that he was so firmly interested in, so enthusiastic to proclaim, that we can hear those things and we too can embrace that idea of freedom to help our neighbors, to remind them of the gospel, and to, again, promote or proclaim truth, the certain truth of Scripture. Again, if you have time afterwards, we can certainly talk more. I'm not going to promise I have answers for your questions, but I will listen to the questions. And I guess in closing then, we're going to sing number 1 here. And didn't we give there was a verse limit on this so that Bear doesn't just fall over. 5? The first 5 verses. Dear Christians, one and all rejoice. there's some more stuff going on back there. Father, thank you for this opportunity to meet together as a body, to hear, to think about some of the ways that you've worked in the past, in history, to build your church, to proclaim your truth. And I pray now that as we experience other things, as we experience fellowship as a body the rest of the day, that we could treasure those things, and that we could be prepared to be your instruments, that we could be there to love our neighbors and do the works that you would have us to do in the world around us. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.